Good morning, dear students. In the last class, we saw the emotional role of language. Today, we will be looking further on, and let us see what is the next one. So, first, let us revise this emotional role. So, expressing the uh, language, through the language, we express emotions, and we also express ourselves. Then we also spoke about the cultural differences that we see through language, the attitudes that people develop because of the language, for a culture and other group and communities. And we looked at also the examples in India. If we look at the example between North and South linguism and regionalism that we have amongst a region, we have at various distance we find that there are slangs changing, language changing, and the attitude of people also change. Now the thing is that with language we have a lot of culture coming in. Every language projects a culture, so there is cultural difference also that we can see with the change of language. Now what as teachers we have to do is accept what is there in the language and the culture that it depicts, and make the students also realize that this diversity helps us to understand each other as individuals better than having a negative attitude towards it. When we talk of language in terms of masculinity versus femininity, we find that there are many languages which are masculine, or which gives an idea of power, the characteristics of masculinity. And there are many languages which seems very delicate, which seems very sweet to listen to. For example, Bengali language or Urdu, we find it is very feminine in nature. Whereas when we hear the Deccan languages or the language from South or Marathi, we find it is having more of masculinity in it. So this goes in worldwide. We find there are many languages which have different types and characteristics in it, and with that even some things, some words change in gender. When we talk of cultural shock, language does give us cultural shock. Earlier, in post independence, we had British English, and when we see the British English today, we find it very decent and uh, um, very nice to hear, to lot of formalities expressed in that. But when we look at the American English, we find it very functional. We find it very, you can call it as to the point, straightforward, and sometimes even incomplete. So that gives us a cultural shock. The person who has learnt in a formal language comes to an informal type of language, finds it culturally very different. This for us would be in terms of Hindi or our regional language. For people who have English as their first language, they may find this difference in American and British accent. So that brings in cultural shock. Also, the language used for conversation sometimes makes it culturally very shocking for us to hear. For example, bai in Hindi would be a maid, whereas bai in Marathi is also used for madam. Now, somebody who comes from a culture where one word is used for a particular, or it has a particular meaning to it, sees the same word used in other language for a different kind of meaning, and it also shows the level or hierarchy of a person. It creates a cultural shock. Another example we can see, which may seem very funny to you all, but for example, the word chore. Now chore in Hindi is chore, that means thief, whereas chore in Malayalam is rice. So the moment this difference of north and south comes in, it creates a cultural shock. Coming to power distance, language does bring in lot of power distance amongst people. When you see an authority talking to a subordinate, or a teacher talking to a student, or a boss talking to an employee, we see that language creates that line of power. It shows how people can project their authority or subordination to somebody through the language. We find that there is a lot of difference between this addressing of person, the other person or second person. If we are speaking about Indian languages, there are words when we speak to the second person. We may be saying, for example, if we look at our common language Hindi, we find that if a person is younger to us, we may use tum, whereas a person who is elderly, we may use aap. Whereas in language, in English language, we find that you is the only term used. So somewhere the power distance becomes less, sometimes through one language, and in another language it may increase the power distance. Also, the tone in language brings in lot of power distance and power play amongst people to show their authority or subordination. So when people use a demanding tone in the language, that shows the power or hierarchy of a person. There are very many things that we see through language. We find when it comes to language bringing in the culture and value, and also displaying, a lot of attitudes. We find that it brings in lot of values. Every language has a value attached to it. If you look at your own mother tongue or your own regional language, you will find that there are various things, various words that brings in lot of values with it. The authenticity in the voice when we are speaking in our own language other than any other language, or when we speak in a second language. For example, in India, second language would be English. So we find that the moment it is our own language, the authenticity is more than using some other language. That goes even for self expression. When we express ourselves genuinely, and when it is full of emotions, it comes out more better when we use our own language. The stylistic innovation of languages we have seen, teachers have also considered stylistic innovations over here would be the use of language for a variety of purpose and in a new way. So now I have very often told you about it, and if you remember the word amazing, it is used for style now, though it is a slang. It is not a formal English, but now instead of saying, very good, or instead of saying the word, sorry, not amazing, awesome, instead of saying the word amazing, we use the word awesome, which is a slang, but it is used for the stylistic purpose of language. Same goes for many such languages where we use the word for hello, we may use hi nowadays. For various such things where we are using new terms, bringing in new trends, and using style and innovation in language to make it more trendy, to make it work according to the needs and desires of the society. So that is cultural difference.